A very warm welcome to the new episode of Ink and Insights. This is your host, Sumit Sharma Samir. This is a Nepal-based podcast, and if you are interested in listening to the thought leaders and authors from around the world, please subscribe to my channel. I'm extremely pleased to welcome Devdutt Pattanaik in my show today. Devdutt Pattanaik is an Indian author, mythologist, and leadership consultant known for his captivating interpretations of ancient Indian mythology and its relevance in contemporary times. Devdutt's breakthrough came with the publication of his first book, Shiva, An Introduction, in 2005, which garnered widespread acclaim for its fresh perspective on the Hindu deity Shiva. This marked the beginning of his prolific literary career, during which he has authored over 30 books, exploring various aspects of Hindu mythology, symbolism, rituals, and spirituality. Some of his notable works include My Gita, Jaya, an illustrated retelling of the Mahabharata, Sita, an illustrated retelling of the Ramayana, and The Pregnant King. One of the distinctive features of Devdutt's writing is his ability to make complex mythological concepts accessible to a wide audience. Through his books, articles, and talks, he bridges the gap between ancient wisdom and contemporary thought, offering insights into human nature, relationship, leadership, and societal norms. His influence extends beyond the literary and corporate worlds. He is a familiar face in the media, appearing on television shows, delivering TED Talks, and contributing articles to newspapers and magazines. His unique perspective on mythology has earned him a large following both in India and internationally. And he continues to explore and interpret Indian mythology, constantly pushing the boundaries of understanding and inviting readers to delve deeper into the timeless wisdom of ancient tales. Through his work, he seeks to inspire reflection, dialogue, and a deeper appreciation of the cultural heritage that mythology embodies. In today's program, we'll largely focus on his new book, Sati Savitri and Other Feminist Stories They Don't Tell You. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Devdutt.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's such an honor to have you in my show because, I always have followed you in the past, but never had a chance to directly talk with you. But this is a rare opportunity. And I also had an opportunity to go through your work on the Kindle version. I don't have a copy version with me right now, but I did read that book, and it's fabulous work. I mean, you have, I think, broken some of the myths that's associated with the feminine thinking. But let me begin by asking two questions that you have asked in your introductions. Is there a way to look at traditional lore without the modern or postmodern lens of judgment, without presupposing the world to be full of oppressors and the oppressed?
Yes, because you see, this lens of looking at the world through the lens of, oppressors and oppressed, which now in its very dark form has become wokeism, is a very Western lens. Because remember, the idea of God as a judge is found in Christianity and Islam. It's not found in Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism. The idea of judgment day doesn't exist, and it's not a big thing. So the way of looking at life, which emerges from European and American universities, is generally to keep judging you. So the modern scholars would judge the past and say the present is better than the past. The postmodern will say if you're powerful and you're privileged, then you are the oppressor. So there's always a combative tone when they try to understand anything. And there are other ways of understanding. That's not necessarily a way of seeing. It's a European and American way of seeing, and I don't think the rest of the world has to subscribe to it.
Right. So on the similar line, can both men and women be simply seen as humans, hungry and frightened, coping with the world and with life, unable to set the burden of biology or privilege or culture?
Well, that's the foundation of people. When you talk to people as people, then you see that they are of course shaped by their biology. They are shaped by their social status. But beyond all that, beyond the social status, I connect with you. You are a human being. And therefore, when someone comes to your house, you say, do you want a glass of water? Or do you want to eat something? Because food, water, is there a comfortable place to sit? Are you comfortable? We are talking to human levels now. We are asking people very foundational questions. When anywhere in the world you go, people expect you to treat even a stranger with respect and dignity. Then comes, of course, how do you deal with me? Are you old? Are you young? Are you male? Are you female? Are you fat? Are you thin? Are you rich? Are you poor? What car you came in? What clothes you wore? All that shapes the way we engage with each other. But at a bottom line, at a very foundational level, we are animals with hunger, fear, imagination, and we are going through life a finite period on time. And I think that sort of helps us, at least for me, in my writings and in my dealings with people. I look at that as the foundation from where everything starts.
Right. So, your new book, Sati Savitri, the first chapter is titled as Wives Who Rescue, where you have narrated the story of Savitri, Sukanya. What does Savitri's life really tells us?
So Savitri is a woman who knows her husband is going to die 1 year later, but she still chooses to marry him. And when death finally comes, she actually confronts death and outwits death and saves her husband. So traditionally, we hear stories of damsels in distress who are attacked by monsters, and the hero goes fighting and saves the heroine. That's the standard monomyth. But this is a very different story. This is a wife who goes and rescues the husband from the jaws of death.
Right.
And death is not a monster, it's life. And so you see a story, and this story is composed 2000 years ago. And it's told very casually. There is nothing dramatic about it. It's being told by Krishna to Yudhishthir, and he's talking about how wives rescue husbands. In fact, it is the next story is the Damayanti story, again told to tell that without a wife, you cannot really be successful in this world. So this conversation is happening 2000 years ago. Where the wife's role is being seen as central to the success of a man. And I think you don't find such stories around the world.
Right. And on the second chapter, which is Damsels Who Get Bored, is all about the Apsaras. And, there's a lot of myth associated with the Apsaras. Can you tell us the meaning of Apsara and what does they symbolize? And why are they important?
So Hindu temples around in India and even in the Southeast Asia, if you go to Angkor Wat in Cambodia, or you go to the Prambanan temples in Java, these are old temples which are no longer functional, but you can see on their artwork images of dancing girls. And at one level, they mean the courtesans in the king's court, the concubines, the beautiful women the king had. But in the scriptures, an Apsara is a celestial being who is bound to no man. She is not connected with a single person. She is enchanting. She can seduce you. She can have fun with you, but she'll go away. She'll never stick with you. And around the world, we have stories of these nymphs who sort of are difficult to hold on to. They come into your life. They make your life wonderful. And then they go away one day. They break your heart. And they're not bound by marriage. They don't care for their children. So they are just these... and that the idea that such women can possibly exist is narrated very powerfully in Indian stories. And as I said, they're also found in other parts of the world in folklore. They are known as nymphs and dryads, and they are seen as untamable creatures, delightful but untamable.
And let me quote you from your second chapter itself. You have beautifully written this. I really love this line. The local women probably had a very different reproductive practices, not based on fidelity, monogamy, and patriarchy. They were apsaras of stories, not satis. This is highly speculative, but is suggested by the little information we have from archaeology of Harappan cities of the Indus Valley and Gujarat coast that predate the Rig Veda by several centuries. Are you suggesting that the patriarchy does not have origin in the Indian subcontinent?
So patriarchy, words like patriarchy to explain human culture, again emerges in scholastic circles who have, assumed a domination by men. But tribes do not really function that way. And around the world, when even you see cave paintings, the role that men do, women do are different. It doesn't mean one is better than the other or one is determining the life of the other. It's just that because women produced babies, the baby was with them, and since the tribe depended on the number of children they have, and maternal mortality rate is high, infant mortality rate is high, women were kept in safer places like caves and homes, while the men would step out more and more. It's not that women were not capable of hunting or doing things, it's just the practical biological needs of child rearing and protecting the children took precedence, and therefore women tended to be more focused on domestic grounds, and men radiated a little outside, and that sort of impacts how societies emerge. Of course, there are societies where women are treated like chattel, but that happens much later, usually after the agricultural revolution. But in many mercantile societies, it has been observed, and Harappa is a mercantile society, that men would go out traveling and they would go to distant lands, and if you go on these ships in those days, there's no guarantee you will return.
Right.
So the women stayed in the house, they stayed in their parents' house, men came, visited them, they had children by them, the children belonged to the mother, they belonged to the woman's household, and the concept of marriage didn't necessarily exist as we understand it today. These are new ideas, and they're usually seen in elite agricultural families, but in non-elite families, in non-agricultural families, marriage has different roles to play, and we presuppose the way we live society. That's 100 years ago in India, there was no concept of monogamy. Rich people had many wives. In poor families, extremely poor families, if a woman became a widow, she was not expected to stay a widow. She was allowed to marry because children were important for labor, and therefore the rules which applied to super rich families and the rules which applied to super poor families were very, very different. And this diversity is something we sort of try to ignore by using one word called patriarchy. And I think I wanted to draw attention that even when you look at Harappa and Vedas, you see in Vedas, the women are very different. In Harappas, the women seem to be more matrilineal because they don't see the bones that they found, the few bones that they found, they were closely related to each other, which means the wives stayed in one place in maybe their parents' house, and they were related to each other. And it was probably a matrilineal, maybe not a matriarchal, but a matrilineal society. That means the woman doesn't leave the father's house or the mother's house.
Right. And also you have mentioned about, Sramani or Bhikkhuni in your the other chapter. Tell us something about this terminology. What does it mean?
So Shramani and Bhikkhuni are words from the Buddhist and Jain traditions. So around 2,500 years ago, in Nepal is very important for that because Buddha comes there. The upper part of Bihar and the lower part of Nepal, that's the region where really it's part of what is called Greater Magad, and this region had a lot of affluence because this is the land of merchants. A lot of trade took place in this area, and there were also a lot of ascetics and hermits took place. And they, amongst them, they sort of introduced the idea of women becoming monks. So you have this idea of men choosing not to marry, women not choosing to marry. And this is obviously a revolutionary idea in a society where men and women are expected to marry and produce children. So Shramani means a hermit woman, Bhikkhuni means an ascetic woman. These are Buddhist women, and we know that there were nunneries across Buddhist spaces along trade routes where women lived, and that's their stories. Their stories in Tamil literature. In South India, you have a lot of images of female mendicants. So women could be, the housewife who has a husband. There is a mendicant or a monk or a nun who has no husband or no wife. And we find their stories told in many literatures, many literatures. And by the way, when I was talking about the Harappan women and matrilineal, I remember when I was in Kathmandu, I saw the Aji shrines along, I went on a road, a lot of temples in Kathmandu on the road, and we found these simple images where womb-like objects were worshipped, and they were called the Aji shrines. The old mother. And again, the same idea emerged. These, old traditions where women made the household, and the men kept migrating based on various economic needs, but the women stayed in one place, and they were not necessarily bound to a single man. That those ideas came later. And I think the bhikkhunis were women who refused to even sit in one place. They refused to have children. They didn't want to have, or maybe they had children, they left the children with their mothers, and they went about their own way, becoming, searching for some spiritual growth. So that possibility existed in India over 2000 years ago. So and India, and I mean the subcontinent.
Right. So it's not the way as interpreted today, like with certain role assigned with the women. I mean, women who did have multiple choices to sort of explore their lives at that point of time, I guess.
I guess so. And I think there is no idea of a third party authority deciding how men and women should live. These are ecosystems where people in their own vicinities are figuring out how to live their lives. There is no holy book that everyone has to follow. So clearly some women married, some women became courtesans, some women were bound to a single man and forced to be, maybe there were kings and warlords who did not let their wives move anywhere or their daughters move anywhere. But there were also women who sort of educated themselves, and they were allowed to wander and become monks and follow monks and live a different kind of life. So I think there were different kinds of women who lived in different systems and society. There's not one rule that applied to everybody, the way we sort of simplify society nowadays.
Exactly. And the concept of sati has been a subject of debate and controversy these days. A lot of debate surrounds that. How does your book navigate this complex issue?
So the word sati is both a proper noun and a common noun first. So the word sati is the first wife of Shiva who immolates herself in her father's sacrificial fire. That sati is a proper noun. And then there is a common noun, sati, which has two meanings. One is, it just means a good, faithful wife, a woman who is very, very faithful to her husband. In fact, she's so faithful to her husband that she develops magical powers. And that her fidelity gives her magical powers. So Sati Anasuya, Sati Renuka, Sati Savitri. So this idea of the Sati who is extremely faithful to her husband, so much that her fidelity grants her magical powers. And the third form of Sati, which is of course very popular, is the widow who burns herself on the funeral pyre. Now this idea attracted the Europeans and especially the British a lot. They couldn't believe such a thing was happening. They found it mostly in Bengal and Rajasthan. Before that, it was happening in warrior communities across India. But there are a lot of hero stones across India where you find images of the woman who immolates herself, and and she's seen as a kind of a goddess. And this obviously, the Orientalist fantasy was fired by this, and they went around saying that all women in India are burnt when their husbands die, and they started exaggerating these stories. Of course, this is a very disturbing practice, but it was a practice, and was not the practice. In some communities, some warrior communities around the world, some people circumcise their children, and in other parts of the world that will be seen as a barbaric practice. Circumcision is considered normal. It's genital mutilation of a kind, but it's seen as a religiously demand. God has told you to cut a part of the child's genitalia, and is considered to be normal. So we can use all kinds of tribal practices exist even in modern times. Some violent, some not so violent, some mutilating, and we consider this to be normal. So in those days, perhaps they just thought that a widow thought if she survives, she may not be treated well. Or she was just forced to kill herself so that her property could be claimed by the family, or that was the only way she could establish honor for herself, or fame for herself for eternity. So these practices did exist in our country, and over time they were rejected over time.
So, there's also a notion of goddesses that sort of, prevalent in our mythology. So when is this notion of goddesses appeared in our thought, and since when did we started worshipping them?
So in the Vedas, the Rig Veda, which is considered to be the foundational thought of Hindu thought, there are about 1,000 poetries. And of the 1,000 poetries, less than 50 poetry deal with goddesses. Right. So very small number of poetry deal with goddesses. The most popular amongst them is the goddess of dawn, Usha. The other goddesses are goddesses of the forest, goddess of the night, goddess, mother of the gods, and there are mention of the wives of the gods. But they don't really play a very important role in the old traditions. But when you go to earlier Harappan seals, we find images of goddesses goddess-like creatures emerging from trees, holding on to tigers, half tiger goddesses. So obviously some kind of a female force is being celebrated. But goddesses, as we know it, really emerge in the post-Buddhist period. So Buddha emerges around 2,500 years ago, but 2,000 years ago, we find, or in fact less than that around, we start finding images of goddesses in Buddhist stupas, the images of Lakshmis. You find images of warrior goddesses in Kushan coins. But about 1,500 years ago, goddesses, Tantra becomes important, and goddess starts to play a very important role in Hindu mythology. God cannot exist without the goddess. This idea becomes very powerful because Sankhya philosophy has become important, where the goddess embodies the material world and God embodies the psychological or the formless or the mental world. So the mind and matter are visualized as male and female. And just as mind cannot exist without matter, God cannot exist without goddess. And that becomes a very important theme in India 1,500 years ago.
Right. And what is this idea of freedom in the Hindu mythology, particularly for women?
So freedom for all human beings. It's nothing to do with men's freedom or women's freedom. The assumption that when we use the word freedom in the Western, modern, liberal sense, we mean I have the freedom to do whatever I want within society, within the law. So freedom to be what I am within society. But when Buddhists, Jains and Hindus spoke of moksha, mukti, freedom, they spoke of freedom from society. They don't want to be burdened by the responsibilities of society. So I don't want to be a wife. I don't want to be a mother. I don't want that burden. But there's also the second burden of the body. I don't want to be burdened by hunger, fear, insecurity. So both the social and the physical burden that is imposed upon us by nature and by culture, I want to get out of that. And that is why the bhikkhunis, the shramanis emerged, because like the men who are the bhikkhus and the shramanas and the wandering mendicants, they wanted to get away from both social burdens and physical burdens.
Is it more of a withdrawal from what they have been endowed with?
Everything. They want to withdraw from what is being expected, from expectations of the world. They want they want to withdraw from their own desires, which causes heartbreak, pain, suffering. So it's a complex battle between their own desires and the desires of people around them. So society imposes needs around you, and you impose need on your own self. Your body craves things, and you want to outgrow that craving because that causes unhappiness, as Buddha said.
And there's a relevance of different goddesses as well in our mythology. What is the relevance of Lakshmi, and why is the notion of fortune tied with the women?
So fortune in most cultures is visualized as a whim, as a woman, for a simple reason that most of the stories were written by men, and when writing is controlled by men, they assume men are the central characters of their lives. But because wealth, food has a nourishing quality, and the idea of nourishment is traditionally seen as a feminine energy. I want to be nourished, so that that which nourishes me becomes feminine, and therefore Lakshmi is that which nourishes me. So the world of wealth, food, glamour, fame, all the things that I desire, what enchants me, what leaves me spellbound, fortune, is visualized as the goddess Lakshmi or Shri, and seen with elephants, seen with lotus flowers, seen with pots of grain and gold, and all things auspicious becomes the goddess Lakshmi. And just as fortune is fickle, the goddess is fickle. It's very difficult to cling on to her. She'll come and go as she pleases.
Right. Interesting. And what is the genesis of Saraswati? How does she come into existence in our imagination?
While Saraswati is a name that is found in the Vedas as a river, In the Vedas, there is another goddess called Vach or Vak, which is a spoken word through which knowledge reaches human beings. And at some level, we believe that that is the origin genesis of the goddess of knowledge, or the vehicle of knowledge. And but really, the images of Saraswati appear in Jain chronicles more than any other things. And the idea that the Jinnavani, or the words of the Jain, the knowledge of that is visualized as a goddess. So all knowledge is visualized as a goddess, just as all wealth is visualized as a goddess and is a Shri, the goddess of knowledge. So different kinds of knowledge, skills, knowledge of science, language, mathematics, philosophy, all different kinds of knowledge become different kinds of vidyas. So you have different vidyas that you worship, and over time that becomes a single goddess, either associated with a swan or a goose or a heron, white colored bird, a hansa, or a peacock. So you find these goddesses associated with learning, with writing, with music, with dance also. So it's everything intellectual, everything aesthetic, performing arts, fine arts, writing, geometry, all that becomes a goddess, Saraswati.
Right. And they were also, equated with the powers, right? That how were Kali or Durga sort of, conceptualized?
So think of a person you consider to be powerful. A man is rich. Now, why is he powerful? Because he has money. So money is visualized as a goddess. Imagine you meet a powerful politician. He has power. He has got, let's say, a democratic power because he's got votes of the people. So that is called Shakti. So that's a goddess that he has got. Imagine you meet an educated person. He says, I'm a PhD scholar. So he has got knowledge. Again, he has a goddess with him. So you become powerful by having something. What is that thing that you have? That is the goddess. What can you transmit? What you leave behind when you die? You leave your wealth behind. You leave your weapons behind. You hopefully leave your knowledge behind if you have written books and put it together. The musical instruments, your skills that you've passed on to your students. So that which can be transmitted is always visualized in feminine form. So, your property, your assets, your cows, your horses, your mutual funds, which you pass on to your children, your books that you pass on to your children, your car, the title, your estate, all that is visualized as the goddess. That which you cannot take away when you die.
Right.
That is the goddess. So goddess will always be around. You will die, but the goddess will never die. So the king will die, but the crown will remain. The throne will remain. So that the crown, so in Kathmandu, she was visualized as the goddess Taleju. Or the goddess will always be there. She will always be. The kings will come and go. Leaders will come and go. The land will always be there. So then the Nepal is visualized, or India is visualized as a goddess, the Bhudevi, the earth. The mountains are the goddesses. They'll always be around. So this is how they visualized what dies is male and what survives is the female.
Wonderful. So giving an example of Ganga in page 139, you have beautifully mentioned that, a free woman is thus compared to a river that does not like dams and canals built by kings to control her flow. Can you please elaborate on that?
So, this can apply to even men. Nobody likes to be controlled. Like we want to live our lives our own way. And unfortunately, we are controlled. Even as men, a man is controlled by his family, is controlled by his wife, his children, his parents. And we all want to break free and live our own life. And that is visualized as a river which flows from the mountain, makes its way through rocks, finds its way to the sea. But on the way, it is blocked and stopped and canals are built. And while we apply to women, it can be applied to men also. That is the reason why Buddha leaves his house, his family, his kingdom, his royal family, and says, I want to go away. I don't want this responsibility. I don't want this burden. So really, he was also wanting not to be, controlled by the ecosystem of his family. Men want that, women want that. Sadly, women are treated as property, chattel, in most countries and most parts of the world. Men, not so much, but sons are property of the father. And the father decides what the son is going to do. Especially the eldest son suffers a great burden. He's supposed to marry. He's supposed to produce children. He's supposed to take care of the family business. that is a burden, because nobody asked. He didn't asked for it. He just was born into it. And therefore, that is what these stories are trying to capture. The entrapment that happens when we are born. Gender is a tool through which they explain it. But in these stories, sometimes gender is a metaphor, and sometimes gender has to be taken literally. And and I've written about how metaphors and are sometimes confused with literal ideas.
Right. So, comparing some of the characters from Mahabharata, like Amba, Ambalika, and Ganga and Satyavati, you have mentioned that with each generation, we see a gradual deterioration in the status of women. Can you please elaborate on that?
So Mahabharata remarkably captures over generations the downfall of women. So the the Ganga is the first woman who negotiates her marriage and her terms of marriage. But by the time we come to Draupadi, she is forced to marry 5 brothers. It's not her choice. So we see this change from generation after generation. Ganga, then Satyavati, then Amba, Ambika, Ambalika, Kunti, Madri, Gandhari, Draupadi, then after Draupadi you have Uttara. So you have these stories from women who choose their lives to women whose lives are chosen from them. And it's very well integrated in the Mahabharata story over generations. So it's obviously the writer is aware of what is happening in society. And he's not blind to it, nor is he saying God said so. He's just saying this is how life turned over time. There is no divine God telling women, there is no Pandora, there is no Eve, there is no Zeus telling women shall be enslaved, or there is that the idea doesn't exist in these stories. But they're saying that as society changed, as human beings became more and more insecure, women lost their agency, they lost their freedom. Ganga transformed into Draupadi.
Right. And you have also mentioned, the divinity in Hinduism is expressed as union of God and goddesses. Without either, there is neither. And that's quite beautifully, expressed. Can you please talk through that?
It's like, your mind and your body. Who are you? Are you your body or are you your mind? If I ask you this question, it's very difficult to answer this question, because when I can't see your mind, but I can see your body and I engage with you through your body. But yet it is your mind which is really where the connections happen. And this idea of the mind and body was presented metaphorically as the union of the man inside and the woman. Our body is feminine and our mind is masculine. And therefore in Tantra, when they say the man and woman come together, they are talking about the mind. At one level, it means the mind and the body. At another level, it means 2 human beings coming together. And one, is the giver, one is the receiver. Is the male the giver, the female the receiver? And the relationship between the two creating things. It could be 2 men, it could be 2 women, it could be 2 friends, it can be 2 enemies. Our lives are determined by people around us. So we become the male and those around us become the female. And that is the kind of, if you see the Buddhist mandalas where the male is in the center and the female yoginis are around them, or the gopikas are around them, it's a metaphor for our life. We are in the center of this, and around us are all these damsels. They can be frightening yoginis, they can be friendly yoginis, we don't know. And life is like that. So they use metaphors to explain this duality, that life happens as a relationship between 2 things, always with 2 things. And that's a unique thing about Tantra, about Sankhya, about Vedic thought, about these are the Indian thoughts. You don't find this in the West, where it's always God and humans. And there is no conversation of man, woman, of 2 people as equals. That concept doesn't exist in the West.
So with the richness of so many stories around us, Mr. Devdutt, I'm kind of wondering, what should we take out, or how should we understand our mythology in the larger context?
I think we should understand it by realizing there's no prescriptions given in India. This whole idea of God telling you how to live your life, or, God told me to do this. No, God doesn't tell you to do anything. You decide what you want to do with your life, but you have to pay the price for every action that you take. And that's the karmic theory, that every action has a reaction. And how we engage with the world, and no matter how hard you try, the fact is, we are all trees in a forest. Some are fruit-bearing trees, some are poisonous trees, but everyone is a tree bringing some value to the world around. The forest doesn't need the tree. So we are not indispensable. All of us can go away, but as long as we live, do we bring value to the ecosystem around us? I think that's the point, which is the larger narrative. Male, female, whatever biology you got, you didn't choose it. You got this biology. You got those parents that you didn't choose. The world, some are born in Nepal, some are born in India, some are born in Pakistan, some are born in America. Life is what we'll make of it. We'll migrate, we'll go in search, or the Apsara will seduce us and break our heart. Or Lakshmi will come into our lives and go away when we need her the most. Or Saraswati will walk into our lives and give us so much wisdom that we don't care for Lakshmi anymore. So these are things that will happen in our lives, and these stories are creating a map for us so that we can navigate our way and say, oh, this is what's happening to me. This is what's going on. And this has happened to other people before me. Some people did have good wives, and some people had horrible wives, and some people had good husbands, and some people had horrible husbands. And, and that's what these stories are trying to tell us.
Right. So my last question would be what do you hope readers will take away from this particular new book, Sati Savitri, after reading it? And what conversations or reflection do you hope it will spark in society?
So I hope that people will, not look to Western's ideas to understand India, but rather use Indian ideas, South Asian ideas, local ideas to understand the rest of the world. And we realize there is so much of poverty and scarcity of thought and the absence of kindness in Western ideas. And that's why the world is becoming more and more cruel, because we see everything in terms of oppressor, oppressed, justice, activism, politics, and everybody's fighting some war to save the world like Marvel comic heroes. But there are other kinds of stories in India, hundreds and thousands of stories, which don't talk about heroes, villains, and victims. And if you want to be comfortable and happy in your life, read books like these, and maybe my book will inspire Indians and people from this part of the world to relook at the stories their ancestors told them.
Surely, Mr. Devdutt, I have read your book, and it's really interesting. It's really myth-busting book, and I recommend everyone to read your book. And thank you so much for your time that you gave to me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.